Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Jennifer Walinga, and I come to you from Royal Roads University. Welcome to our webinar series on leadership, sport, and social change. This is episode 10. It's kind of remarkable to me because when Amar and I were first planning this series, we thought we'd maybe do 3. And here we are in episode 10 in 19 months of COVID and learning online. But we're really excited to welcome people to each of these episodes and into our online environment as well. It's wonderful to see so many people partaking in these kinds of technological environments now and learning the capacity that technology offers you for learning. This episode is about sport as education. We've touched on lots of different topics, and of course they all interrelate. And we've welcomed probably 50 fantastic panelists over the months that we've been doing this. So it's wonderful to welcome 3 more fantastic educators. I'm sure you'll all have so much to learn from each of them, and I'll try to create as much space as possible for them to share their principles, philosophies, and stories. We first like to acknowledge and thank the Lekwungen and Kusepsan people, also known as Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities, for they allow us to teach and learn, live, work, and play on their lands. We honor the ancestors, supernatural ones, hereditary leaders and matriarchs, and creatures big and small, for sustaining the rich resources and cultural teachings of the beautiful land upon which we reside as a campus. We also acknowledge that acts of colonization, like requiring Indigenous children to attend residential schools and the ongoing high rates of Indigenous children in care, has made many inequities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in multiple forms. Despite these acts of colonization, Indigenous people continue to have vibrant communities and cultures. And as a social purpose organization, we want to recognize that we have a responsibility to work towards truth and reconciliation and to remain open to suggestions, learnings, consultations, especially with our local Indigenous neighbors, on how our organization can continue to work towards truth and reconciliation. I too live on the lands of the Lekwungen people, but I spent a lot of time in Saanich or Wasanich territory, rowing backwards in a boat on this beautiful little lake called Elk Lake. We at Royal Roads really do learn from our landscape, from our land. We spend a lot of time taking students into the old growth forest. We have 300 hectares of that surrounding our campus, and we have fabulous ocean front. We have mountains in the distance. It's quite a remarkable place, but we're constantly reminded by what nature has to teach us, right? The interdependency, the sustainability that's required, and the attitude of sustainability that's required in order for us to endure. We also believe at Royal Roads in acknowledging what people bring to the campus. So everyone's had an education, whether it's called a degree or not. You've learned in different contexts within your life. And we have a unique partnership with Game Plan, an organization that supports athletes as they leave their career in high level or high performance sport, helps them transition into communities or career pathways. But we try to acknowledge the learning that they garnered through their sport experience. So this is Andrea Burke. Doug Tate will know her well. She's a rugby player. I don't say former because she continues to play, but I was lucky enough to supervise her through her master's, and a great spokesperson for Royal Roads, now teaching with us as well. But, you know, acknowledging, she spent a lot of time distilling what she'd learned from her sport and then contributing back to her sport through her studies. And so we conceived of this idea of sport leadership and social change because, you know, personally, I dedicate a lot of my energy to researching how sport can deliver on its promise to society for human and social development. It offers a beautiful vehicle for people to learn principles that can really help us thrive in our world. And there are so many organizations across sport that promote these kinds of concepts. And at Royal Roads, we mirror a lot of these concepts as well. Our programs are actually precise mirrors of what sport kind of believes in and embodies. We have programs in development, diversity and inclusion, education, environment, equity and human rights, health, media and communications, and peace. And so we wanted to talk about a lot of the ideas that are promoted through these organizations and through sport as a concept, the idea of human rights and the ability that everybody has a contribution to make through sport, and sport highlights that, promotes that, showcases that. We also like to weave in this idea, and I love this little image of the bridge. This is on our campus. It's in the Japanese garden. Our campus is surrounded by all these beautifully maintained gardens by our small group of our team of gardeners. But the bridge for us in our School of Communication and Culture, where I operate out of, is a metaphor for us for communication, obviously. But it's more than that. It represents this idea that in order to actually build a relationship or form some sort of bridge between communities or individuals, whether it's a handshake or an actual, contract or an actual structural bridge, first you have to start with minding the gaps. That means appreciating, embracing diversity, understanding the power of diversity and how important it is to have those two different sides, and then begin to bridge the actual gap between those two different sides. Now that takes work to understand the differences. And I think sport embodies that principle beautifully as well. So welcome to episode 10, Sport as Education. And I'd like to introduce our three panelists. We have Cheryl Bernard, a hero of mine, and I hear that word used for her and about her often as I was researching more about her background, Googling her and creeping her a little bit on Facebook. She's the CEO now of the Canada Sports Hall of Fame and doing fabulous work there. She was an Olympic curler and went to the Olympic Games in 2010 and 2018 and won a silver medalist with her team in 2010. I remember watching the final game, so fabulous. Has worked with TSN as an analyst. You see her here with her buddy Russ Howard doing a fabulous job, and also an author. And I love this title, Between the Sheets, very cheeky, creating curling champions, and Between the Sheets, the Silver Lining. And I think both just offer such great wisdom and insight to athletes in all sports. Worth a read. I'd also like to welcome Gary Barber, a longtime friend and colleague of mine. We taught together in middle school for many years. And again, another hero, someone I really look up to as an educator and coach. And I followed Gary for many years as a runner, of course, as well. He's quite spectacular. Attended the represented Canada at the Commonwealth Games, I think in 90 and 94, Gary, is that correct? I wasn't sure if I had the dates. You can talk more about it as we chat.
Yeah, a long time ago, a galaxy very far away. Yeah.
You're so humble. It's hard to find information about your actual sport background. Also an author of many books, 3 books on athletics, and Gary will talk more about the content of those because it weaves in so well into his philosophy as both a coach and educator. And he's taught for, well, he just shared with us 31 years. So I guess you started teaching when you were about 9 years old, apparently.
Yeah, that's what I tell the students.
Exactly. And welcome to Doug Tate. Doug just retired from coaching at UVic, but I know he's still so involved in the community and in the rugby community in particular. Has coached at UVic, the University of Victoria, for 28 years actually now, because he extended that time through COVID. Also instructs at UVic in exercise science, physical education, and has also played and coached and been the technical director for the Canadian national rugby team. And I'll invite each of my panelists to share more about themselves and their philosophies, and it speaks well to the topic today. I wanted to remind everybody that all through the webinar, please just post questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll get to them. I keep my eye on there, and Amara does as well. And I think all of us actually start noticing things that people are contributing, comments, questions. Participate as much as you like. And sometimes we invite people to turn their mic on and share their ideas as well. That's wonderful. And also wanted to share some contact information that we'll share out when we share the recording of the webinar, so that you can follow these people online or connect with them in some of their exploits as professionals. And also introduce you to our next episode. I'm hoping to we sort of pull it all together in the month between, but my next concept is this cultural framework for leading safe and high performance sport environments, because we can do it all in sport. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see these lovely faces. And you can always go up to your view if you want to see just the speakers. And but you can also see that wonderful mosaic of all the participants, everybody that's joined us today. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day and share as well that, of course, you can get the webinar afterward and recording and post that wherever you like. Share it with friends, and we love to share the wisdom that people will be kind enough to share with us today. great to see some familiar names in there of former students and current students, but also colleagues from across the sport community. All right, so I'd like to start by asking each of you to share a bit about, what are some things that drew you to sport? First of all, why are you in sport still? Why are you connected to sport? Why is it so important to you? What has kept you there in this role of kind of building sport, protecting sport, and communicating about it through your various channels? And who would like to start? I see Gary with his, and Gary will have to leave us a little bit early. He's a busy teacher still, so he'll get pulled away at 1:15. So go ahead, Gary.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for everyone for, first of all, the wonderful introduction, Jennifer, and it's a pleasure to join you all on this panel today. I've been a runner for all my life, right from probably 3-4 years of age. I just loved movement and being able to sort of express myself through activity. And I found that it's actually perhaps one of the profound ways I learn. I learn by keeping moving. I'm often pacing around the room when I'm learning, and much to the distraction of my colleagues. And I'm probably fidgeting right now as I speak, but yeah, love to move. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, I actually attended a funeral, and I found out that a relative of ours had won an Olympic gold medal in the 400-meter hurdles at the Los Angeles Olympics. And to me, that was like discovering that Santa Claus really was real, and it was just fantastic to find that there was an Olympic gold medal there. And his name was Robert Tisdall, and he. I have a picture of him that I found in an old book in an antique shop, and it's framed. It's on my wall. So being sort of feeling that I had a sort of a familial connection to sport through the Olympics just fueled my ongoing love for running. I found that it allowed me to form friendships, lifelong friendships, travel all over the world, meet wonderful people, go to such interesting cities, and it's been a key part of my life. I have 2 sons, both of them have autism, and I realized the importance of physical activity in the sort of the therapeutic approaches that we needed to help them to manage their disabilities. And so the love that I've had from sport, I've been able to sort of share with my boys and help to support them in their sort of ongoing development. And my eldest, Michael, is actually now a part of the Canadian Paralympic team, and he just missed out on Tokyo by about a second. He missed qualifying, but he's very young and has a great future in front of him. So in a nutshell, sport is still a very big part of our lives, has shaped the person that I am in so many ways. That's probably about enough.
I love hearing these stories, and those moments of inspiration are fabulous. Thanks for sharing. And Cheryl, how about you?
Thanks, Jennifer. That was amazing, Gary. And thank you for the introduction, Jennifer. I think I was thrown into sports as a kid. I've been curling since I was 8. So at one point you don't have a choice. It's just what your parents do, and they throw you into the curling rink. But, over time, I think I began to understand the value of it, and probably not at 8, but probably in my mid-teens, I understood and watched other girls drop out of sports at a fast rate. And I was starting to love to compete, and I was starting to do well, and that attracted me to stay in the game and continue to play. For me with sport, I've never been able to get out of it at all through my life. I mean, even now, my life has come full circle. I'm back as the CEO at Canada Sports Hall of Fame, and I didn't think that I would be the person that should, let me say this the right way. I didn't think when I looked at this job and they came to me that I wanted to promote elite athletes. But what I realized over time, and my passion for this hall and the Hall of Famers, is you're not promoting elite athletes. That goes beyond. They all, yourself included, Jennifer, have accomplished great things in sports, but what I'm promoting is what these individuals are doing beyond sport and giving back, and as role models, and teaching us all lessons about overcoming adversity and difficulties in life. And I think the passion for this place grows every day. And so I'm so fortunate. I'm so lucky to be able to be here and be surrounded by these stories. And we represent everything. It's inclusion and diversity and accessibility. And I think when you go to education, which is the discussion today, for youth, if you can just tell and share your story, that is the greatest lesson for youth. You're a role model for them to follow. We've just recently been featuring some stories on our Indigenous Hall of Famers, because now we're building role models for Indigenous youth to follow. It's the, if you can see it, you can be it concept. And I think that's so important, because they go, you know what, I can overcome. Willie O'Ree talked about, and he's being inducted this year, and he talked about racism as a hockey player, Black hockey player growing up. And his stories just bring me to tears, yet he is a perfect example for youth, and why I'm here at Canada Sports Hall of Fame promoting the Hall of Famers.
That was awesome. Thank you. And, you know, it speaks to what Gary just talked about, knowing that, oh, I have a relative who can do it. Well, then I guess I could too, right? It's so inspiring and crucial. So thank you for the work that you're doing, Cheryl. I know it's just been fabulous to watch it evolve, and we're lucky to have you there. Thank you. And Doug.
Yeah, just again, thanks everybody for coming on. I think that for me, sport just sort of, I think it started with wrestling and boxing, my three brothers, and then I learned how to run and outrun them. And I had some great, we had some great chases where we lived in Vancouver. Basically, we'd run all the way. I'd keep running a block. I was faster than them, so I could run, get a couple blocks ahead of them, and then I'd walk for a while, and then they'd start chasing me again. I wasn't as fast as Gary, but it was fast enough for them, and that's really all that mattered. So then we'd be tired by the time we got down to where we lived in Jericho, Spanish Bank. So we'd be run on the sand, and then we'd walk back home. So that was sort of the start of my athletic career. And then I really was into football for a long time. And it basically got me into coaching, because the coaches I had some pretty crazy coaches. It was the late, I guess it was the 70s. And so I started coaching 13-year-olds right out of high school for a couple of years. And then I kind of got too busy with rugby, and I'd actually had switched to volleyball and rugby. So I think when all of us were growing up, you could play a lot of different sports, and the seasons didn't really, you know, there was one season and the next season, and you could do multiple things. So I was sort of a multi-athlete, and so I ended up going to UBC and teaching for 10 years in Vancouver before I came to UVic. So that was a sort of, and along the way, had to pick a sport at one, eventually rugby, but a lot of people were at that time were playing multiple sports. So I have and then coached a lot of different sports. So I have a big interest in, you know, coaches and various sports. Doesn't really matter what it is. Always sort of interested in their approaches and what they do. And I think I really hit home when I took a year's leave of absence and went to the National Coaching Institute at UVic at the time in the early 90s. And there was 16 people in that year. And we basically spent every day together for about 8 months. And they were from every sport: rowing, sailing, downhill skiing, rugby, football, you name it, soccer. So it was, I learned a lot from the other coaches, much more than I thought I would when I signed up. So that's sort of been my background. And then the coaching thing sort of happened at UVic when I was there, and I basically stayed for, you know, pretty close to 30 years. So, but I knew it was, you know, it was time to let somebody else do it. And yeah, I'm always, I was on I got sort of roped into doing a thing for New Zealand Sport recently, for North Harbour Sport, which was quite interesting, and just the way they do things down there. And there was a lot of people on it from all over the world, and I was doing a thing I was on motivation, but there was some really interesting people on there. And so I would highly recommend that, especially with what's happened in COVID, is there's been some unbelievably good webinars and different things you can drop in on, which before they weren't really happening as much. So I think it's been it's a lot to learn from different people, for sure.
Right on. And so I'm really hearing from you, Doug, this kind of curiosity that you're a learner. You know, you're talking all the time about appreciating what you're learning and seeing different sports, different people, different countries. And so you mentioned at the very beginning, you know, what got you into coaching was having a few crazy coaches in football. So what sparked you to want to learn how to deliver sport well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the number one thing for me was that I didn't really like the way they were doing stuff. You know, it was they didn't really have any technical information. They was basically just yelling at people. And so I see that a lot still in football, and I use it in some of my graduate classes. There's lots of stuff you can pull off the internet where, you know, halftime talks and that, where there's really nothing being. It's not anything technically. They're not helping the players. They're just berating them. So it's I've seen that a little bit, you know, and then I sort of kind of interested. Sometimes I watch. I think one of the interesting things for me was when I was away with the national team, or I was away with just the UVic team. We'd go to parks all over the Lower Mainland or whatever, and we'd always be there early. So as the players were in the change room, that sometimes I'd go next door and watch there could be a soccer game going on, and just watching a youth sports and some of the coaches. This is quite a long time ago. I used to film them, these coaches, but then I realized ethically I probably shouldn't be showing that into my classes. But it was the same type of players that are getting picked on, players that were on the wing, there's players that were on the outside edges, and you could just tell that they're cringing some of the coaching and some of the behaviors of the parents and whatever. So I've always found that kind of an interesting thing in sport, and some people can't control it, but I think that we work hard to maybe try to make some changes in that area.
Absolutely inspired, right? To how to really deliver it well. And so my next question is about that, you know, do you think how's it doing? How would you kind of rate sport generally in Canada? Maybe across the world, because we've seen sports happening all over the world, especially just after the recent games. But, you know, how do you think sport's doing on delivering, you know, its ability? It has potential to teach beautiful things about, you know, working together and appreciating diversity, about confidence and developing your own awareness of your own capacity. So much that you can learn through sport. It depends on the delivery of it. And how are we doing, do you think, in general? What are some comments that you might have on that? Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, so an area that I'm particularly passionate about, I guess, is the role of sport in education, and looking at different programmatic approaches to helping children, young people acquire skills that will serve them well, not only in their sports career, but also for life. So inevitably, there's a sort of overlap in a number of areas. You have your sports developmental approach, so developing elements of character that we're all familiar with. And there is actually a bit of a challenge in this kind of conversation, is that often the language that is used, terms are used interchangeably. So you have values and virtues, you have competencies, you have soft skills, habits of mind. And sometimes those ideas are used in ways that imply certain things to promote a particular agenda. And so the terminology gets a little confusing. The way that I approach it with the young children that I teach is that, first of all, we're looking to develop a sense of who we are. And so develop a positive feeling of self-esteem, and then develop competencies in social circumstances, whether that be on the sports field, and then its transference into life. So I think the programs that currently exist try to follow the different kinds of agendas, and they can be a little bit hit and miss, I think. There's the one program that I was involved with for a while, the Olympic Values Education Program. So it's based out of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And one of the difficulties that this program runs into is that there's not always a common agreement about what values mean they mean different things in different parts of the world. And that's what I am trying to allude to with agendas. Honesty isn't interpreted in the same way in some countries. The prevalence of cheating in some countries, it's, well, if you have to take drugs, or if you have to kind of bend the rules a little bit, but you gain success, well, hey, why not? You're more fool for you if you don't actually take that approach. Right. So there's some sort of challenges in this very debate about what makes for good sport and education. Whose values are you trying to promote? Are they universal values, widely accepted, or are they sort of values that are being promoted by governments? And I mean, there's some that we might sort of say, well, they are national universal values: inclusion, respect, diversity, and I think Canada does a very, very good job on promoting those kinds of ideals that we stand by. There are other areas that I think we can. There's work that needs to be done. I think there's some issues around using sport to improve social access and equity. I think those are issues for us as a country, especially with Indigenous communities. Rates of participation are not the same as other communities. So yeah, I'm kind of rambling a bit here, but I think the value of sport and in education shouldn't be understated. It's a powerful vehicle to be used to help the youth of Canada develop to values that we as a country hold and cherish.
And I like the way you've distinguished. I often do that in my teaching around leadership as well. When we talk about values, to be clear, there are values that are universal. I like that word. I'm going to steal it. Kind of moral code or ethics. Those kind of values that we agree upon and that we hold as human beings. And then there are priority values, where what do you hold as important? Sure. And just to differentiate. And yeah, in some countries, it's a priority to win at all costs, and they're willing to sacrifice some of those universal values in order to. So in Canada, you're seeing that we are working hard. I'm definitely seeing within certain NSOs that they're working hard, national sport organizations, to on that particular topic of access and inclusion. Hey, it's good to see. And that's thanks to a lot of the work from a lot of athletes actually pressing for that. Super. And I'm also hearing an alignment with the UNESCO values in some ways around education. And we do that at Railroads as well. Learning to work together along with the know and the doing, knowing and the doing. All right. How about Cheryl? What comments do you have to make about, how are we doing in Canada and maybe across the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think good and bad. I think I looked at the Tokyo Olympics and their slogan, I think, for the Tokyo Olympics was stronger together. And they really, really pushed that. And I loved that messaging. I think we're hitting it and we're really nailing it in some areas, but then we're also letting, Russia continue to compete under different names. And I don't think that is the right message either. I ended up calling curling this year with a Russian team playing, but they just can't call themselves a Russian team. And I don't think that message is great. In the end, though, I think we're getting better. I think media is a big part of it. I think what they portray and the messages that they show. I looked at, there's probably 10 inspiring stories from Tokyo and every Olympics there is that teaches such good values and lessons to all of us, not just youth, to all of us. I looked at, I think it was the high jump, and they ended up deciding to share the medal. That was, I think we're nailing it in some areas. I think we're failing in others. Maybe that is what it is. The pendulum always seems to have to kind of swing one way, swing the other, and settle back in. And maybe that's how sport is always going to be. But I do think media has a responsibility. Athletes, all of us included, have a responsibility that, to me, it's sport teaches more than sport. It's beyond, you don't learn, when we promote sport here at the Hall of Fame, we're not promoting to learn how to kayak or high jumper, we're promoting the values of what you learn through sport at any level. You don't have to be elite. And so I think if that continues to work, and I agreed completely with Gary, there are some specific values that countries value and to win at all cost, but that's not our mandate here. And I think that is a good thing because it becomes more inclusive for so many other individuals to, come from different countries, newcomers to Canada, and it doesn't exclude them from participating and learning all the same values we have here.
Jennifer, do you mind if I make a comment about seminal questions when we come to discussions about values? And this is almost cliched: is are they taught or are they caught? And how do we go about actually teaching those values? And as we've already discussed, whose values are they? And but a group of students that meet, sometimes about 20 to 30 students, we have what we call our Olympic club. And we meet once or twice a week, but we're not discussing or lionizing the success of elite athletes, the superstars. We're discussing about the issues that these athletes have to face, and we're not just talking about overcoming adversity, but you can't actually talk about character and raising, developing your sense of involvement in sport without addressing some much bigger issues as well. For instance, we're going to have a Winter Olympics very soon, and you can't have downhill skiing without snow. You can't have athletes breathe in air in these polluted cities without having clean air. So you can't separate discussions about climate change and the bigger existential threats to our society and separate that from a discussion about respect, which is a core Olympic value. Often we think about the core values: friendship, excellence, and respect. And it's not just, good old sportsmanship, just getting along with people, but invariably you have to have respect for the environment. So now we're often running with quite a detailed conversation about, what does sport really mean? It's actually not going to mean an awful lot if we can't do it. If we're having Olympic Games in 45 degrees centigrade and athletes are passing out or dying, you can't separate those kinds of conversations from the Olympic Games. We also talk about the respect for different values or sexual orientations, we think, these are things that we take for granted in our country, and fundamental respect for that. That's not the case in Russia, where Vladimir Putin was extremely unhappy about having athletes with different sexual orientations participating at the Sochi Olympic Games. These are the heavy topics, but if we're looking to have a broader understanding of what sport means, you can't separate it from the things that the planet's currently facing and will continue to face. In some regards, the Olympics is backward looking in that it really cherishes and celebrates its artifacts, its traditions, and of course history informs the present. But I think we need to look a little bit into the future and say, what kind of world will our children and our athletes compete in or participate in as we move into the future? How will we prepare them? What kind of soft skills or value skills will they need in order to navigate this complex world? And so this club that I have, we meet, and this is for 10-year-olds. These are not, it sounds heavy duty topics, but they're obviously presented in a manner which young children can address. But we have some pretty rich conversations.
Love it. And I've got a question in my little list, around leveraging sport. And I think we'll talk more about that as we get going. What are some ways, and we've heard that from the hall, you as a teacher, there are ways to leverage sport to educate on the rugby pitch, and you all have techniques for that. I want to touch on this point that you were making about, although I think it's why I love sport, it mirrors society. I used to kind of apologize for using it as a metaphor for everything, and I taught, and now I don't apologize at all, because I really do think in my 50s, I'm realizing, no, it is. It absolutely is a model for the world, and it embodies everything: the environment, interaction, communication, respect for the greater, the public. You're interacting with them at all times as well. And when you're putting on a game, it's really a great lens to look through, and an incubator in a way for us to really understand how the world could work better. Doug, I want to ask you though, how do you think we're doing in Canada in terms of our sport delivery? And you were watching that from a young age, watching the berating and the picking on the kids, and that where it can fail. How do you think we're doing in terms of delivery of sport as an educational opportunity?
I think that there's a lot of good things that are happening. There's no question. I think I think some sports in Canada have evolved into, the education might not be standardized across the group. In other words, like when it was all NCCP, you went through this, you went through that, you did your level 3. A lot of times I didn't agree with some of the things they're doing. They're promoting people just by being, having a heartbeat, being in a seat. So, some of it was, for me, I thought was kind of weird. But then some sports took it on their own and did it. And then, in some cases, it's hard to get advancement. I think one of the things that we're doing poorly in Canada is that we're charging people a lot of money to be certified and become coaches. And I think that we should be doing a better job within our own associations to privately get money to help those people, identify people. In Cheryl's case, maybe curlers, identify good people and help them. Because if not, it eliminates a lot of people. And in rugby, it's got a real problem with, there's certain people that can afford it, and they come from big wealth and private schools, and sometimes the players that should be advanced never advance because they can't afford to be advanced. So, and the coaches too. So I think there's ways to go in that regard. It's actually kind of a question that I asked a grad class this summer. How are we doing in sport? And basically, it came about because of the Olympics, and we were watching the Olympics, and someone brought up a good point, and I had made mention of this the day before, that what are we doing? We've got 11-year-olds skateboarding, going down a rail with no safety equipment, no helmet. To me, it made no sense. Whereas, and they're wiping out, they're bleeding, they're limping, and so it was like, it wasn't, they weren't getting hurt. It was almost comical. Like, it was like, and they're hardly landing, and they're just smashing on concrete. And I thought, this is something that, meanwhile, the other sports have lots of rules and regulations in them that would avoid that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So people said, what are we trying to do here? And so from a more of a global thing, I thought they were sort of missed the point a little bit. They're arguing obviously on the sports, and come to a conclusion that they're trying to get sports that are going to attract a bigger audience and obviously sponsorship. So there's things in there that I thought we could do better. But getting back to Canada, it was interesting. Nathan Hariyama, who was the flag bearer for Canada, played at UVic for many years, and then he'd been coaching with us all last year while he was playing with the national team. So he was on our coaching staff, and he was amazing. And he basically said, I was texting him when he was in Tokyo, and he said that all the talk in the village among the athletes was about Osaka and Simone Biles. Basically, they were talking, that was a lot of the conversation was going around about the welfare of athletes and all that kind of stuff. And it was actually kind of neat, some of the things that he was saying, but he was basically saying it's not a lot of what the media is saying, and trying to blow this thing up. They obviously, so I think in one of the things in sport right now, it's really not any place to hide for athletes. It's out there so fast, and there's so much. And maybe one thing we could do is we always have to teach them a little bit better. And I like a lot of the stuff that Cheryl and Gary were saying about the values and that. But I think some of the things, the little basic things about practical things about the media and how to deal with it is you saw it recently in the U.S. Open in the tennis. I mean, that's a lot of pressure for those kids going through. They were young, 18 and 19. I would thought they were amazing, actually.
Amazing.
So, yeah, so that's the thing. And I think that for me, like the teaching the values thing, if you get down to a team level or a program level, I do a lot of that through captain or leadership team. And I've had some unbelievable captains over the last 5 or 6 years that one guy basically met everybody in the summer on his own, had an interview with every player, and did this big cultural shift and stuff, and wrote a manual. And I mean, he made a big difference. I mean, and it was like probably the best thing as a coach is they became automatic, and they were taking over a lot of the things that you just hope that they would do. So I like a lot what said about the values thing. I believe strongly in that.
So, promoting, giving space to and a stage to those leaders within your group to then take on that role of fostering cultural values that are really productive and positive. And you talk a bit about where we're failing around, I would say, leadership at the global level, right? Where we're commodifying, we're losing sight of what the Olympics are really for, and we're starting to allow money to drive the business, which is always dangerous. Should be supporting. And then you mentioned Doug, about coaching and access. It's something we talk about, access for athletes a lot and how expensive it is, play hockey. I've had friends discouraged her son. She was discouraged from keeping her sons in hockey because she was a single mom. And he's like, you're never going to be able to afford it. I thought that was just crazy. We're missing out on all these great kids. But you're talking about the coaches too, where we end up moving people through the system who can afford to pay for the credentials or the courses or whatever kind of hoops you have to jump through. Being careful around you mentioned NCCP, and I just want to clarify National Coaching Certification Program, and that has been centralized, but then it's also been, national sport organizations have taken that on independently, and we could do a better job of that. But I love your comment about the practical too, that how do we prepare athletes, not just as athletes on the field or as human beings with each other or with society, but also preparing them for some of the challenges that you're going to face. And Gary was touching on that too, big things like climate change, big things like Russia being in the same Olympics, if you may disagree with that fundamentally and politically, big things like Rule 50, like whether you're allowed to protest on the podium. And things like, how do you deal with the pressure of the media? That's what I worry about these young, like our young tennis player in Canada, right? She's going to become, it's just like Eugenie all over again, she's going to become very famous, and is she equipped to deal with that? Wonderful. Other comments about that? How are we doing? Where are we falling? Where are we failing? Where could we do better? What do you think would help Canada do better?
I'd like just to ask more of a question to maybe people have more information about this than others. I don't have a lot of information about it, but I look at, like, sometimes in our sports system in Canada, if we're talking about Canada, with Own the Podium, where, there's a lot of money involved, obviously, and it's results based. A lot of the things that we do are results based. And I worry sometimes, like, where some sports really struggle if they don't have a global organization that's giving them funding or whatever. They're basically on their own. If they don't, to get to somewhere where you are good enough to compete at the Olympics or qualify, in our sporting world with our geography, you do need money to get the competition. So sometimes I worry that some of the way it's set up, it favors certain sports, or it keeps going, that can be successful. It must be really tough for the people that run On the Podium to do it as an objective manner, I would think. Does anybody have a comment?
Yeah, comments on the podium, the funding models, and we've seen them in multiple countries. But what do you think about that? If it's based on, ours is based on results, right? What's the most, in the UK, They call it credible. What's the most credible sport? And that means what sport's going to be most likely to win us some medals?
I would just like to comment that I'm not intimately informed about the different funding models, but my eldest son, he's 21 years old, and mentioned to the panel just before we started that he has autism, but he's on the Canadian team for the Paralympics, and he's a carded athlete. He's supported by Athletics Canada, which I guess is also funded through Own the Podium. And even though competition was somewhat, highly restricted and limited, travel was non-existent for the last 2 years, the support that he had throughout this COVID time was absolutely unflinching. It was superb. And I think it's a testimony to the federal government and the programs like Own the Podium, who they could have looked at these sorts of programs and say, look, there's not a lot going on for the next couple of years. We'll cut you back. We'll slash funding here and there. They didn't do that at all. In fact, if anything, certain areas funding improved. And so we, in our family, have been so grateful for the kind of support that has been offered to him and I think that actually speaks to the success. And I can only talk here about the Canadian athletics team. Had a fantastic Paralympics and able-bodied Olympics, lots of medals, top 10 performances all over. And I think the approach that they're taking right now is first rate. It's bringing results, but it's doing it not with a gluttonous approach where they're throwing hundreds of millions of dollars and trying to purchase a medal. It's done in a measured, proportionate way. It's thoughtful, and I think it's been very impressive.
Yeah, no, and I well said, Gary, and I think I can speak to it as an athlete coming up supported by Own the Podium, which, I honestly will say, I don't think we would have stood on a podium without that support. You have access to sports psychologists and to nutritionists and counselors, and it's not extravagant. You had to pick, you get a budget that's laid out for you, and you had to justify all the expenses, but it really gave us the opportunity, that somebody believed in our team, which was almost bigger than the dollars they put behind it, but also B, that you had to learn how to identify your weakness as a team. And so then you put whatever funding you could towards that weakness as a team. And so, I really believe, I wish it started earlier would be the only, downfall with it, is that we didn't get identified until we were probably an Olympic likely. But they're starting to build out in curling anyway. I can't speak to all sports now, some programs that are, what they would call Olympic hopefuls potentially coming up. So they're starting to try to identify and fund that as well. But I don't know how they identify in this country, because I look around it, there's so many Olympic hopefuls in every sport. I wouldn't want to be part of Own the Podium to try to have to pick where that funding goes, but I can speak to the value of it and how it helped our team specifically.
Wonderful. And good approach, that idea that, keep pressing for that measured, that's not gluttonous, that keep that in perspective, but also the support people need in a way that will help them just advance that much more. It's good to hear people appreciating what the sport institutes and centers are providing in terms of the more holistic support, not just the technical, but the nutritional and the mental and the emotional support that you can get as well. Great. And the decision-making, right? How do we do it in a way that's balanced and fair and inclusive? Yeah. And there have been criticisms about the idea that we're going to fund medal potential, that it's all based on medals, or you'll get more funding if you win a medal. And there are challenges around that. Comments about that, that basing funding on results. Is there a different approach you'd like to see, or what are the advantages? Go ahead, Doug.
That's a tough one. I think that Cheryl pointed out, and Gary, they're getting the help they sort of need. So if it's justified and they're doing the best they can, it's tough. There are so many sports in Canada. We try to be good at a lot of different things, like it's pretty broad-based. It's not like some countries where they narrow it down to, 5 or 6 sports. We were like, I don't know how many we have, but it's it's a tough, I don't know, like.
We're also talking about values here, and there'll be an individual who would say, well, what values do we have in our society when we want to fund people playing games and going off to exotic locations to do sports, when we have needs and then you apply the social context? Is it hospitals, education, clean water? Mm-hmm. You start making judgments about how do we spend the taxpayer purse, and I think it's is there an answer or the answer? Of course there isn't. So we start making decisions based on our comfort zone. So I think we have governments that value sport and see its role in society and its health benefits, for the overall well-being of the general public. How much should be spent on it? Well, that's it starts getting political and contentious, and we talk forever about that.
No, I agree. But aren't you building role models? And even if that role model goes on, and yes, it's somebody that was given a hand up to get where they got to, they were supported. But if one youth looks at Leila Fernandez, or how many youth are looking at her and saying, I'm going to take up tennis, like this is, so I see both sides of it. I understand that it's hard to choose and fund, but if you're promoting role models and success in sport, at least if it tempts youth to pick up a racket or try to throw a curling stone, and no, not everybody's going to stand on a podium or win a US Open, but that's the healthy, and what you learn. Again, we go back to the sport as an educator. The parallels between sport and life are uncanny. And as you said, Jennifer, it's a microcosm. And so it can't hurt that you funded somebody to go stand on that podium or win that big event. And now you've got all these youth saying, I want to try sport. I want to compete. I want to, and yes, many of them won't go on to an elite level, but they will get some incredible value out of sport.
Right on. So you're investing, okay? So tying it into this value, we value sport. We're investing in it. We're investing, as long as we're not just investing in only gold medals at all costs, right? We're also investing in role models, in showing leadership. With Leila did beautifully. I mean, her graciousness, and then her acknowledgement of the pain of New York that on that day of 20th anniversary of 9/11, and the appreciation. And even, Djokovic was transformed through the US Open, it seemed. It was amazing. And so we're investing in success, but also in a success that is worthy of a role model, something we can look up to. Yeah, I'm not sure we're that explicit in Canada. We could probably be more so. We've got a question from Peter Webster, who's one of our participants too, around mental health. And so Simone Biles and others were speaking strongly about how important it is to be looking after all parts of the athlete, right? And developing all parts of the athlete. What are your thoughts on how we're doing in that regard? Or what are some, how important is it? Or what are some techniques that you think are crucial in coaching that are, I know, I read about Doug and some of the comments when he was retiring from his athletes. Well, all the comments were talking about him developing them as whole people. And so James O'Neill, for instance, in one of the write-ups, through my 4 years playing for Doug, it was obvious his number one concern was developing us into well-rounded individuals first, varsity student athletes second. Thoughts on that?
James, I gave him $20.
Yeah.
James is a pretty unique, straight ahead. He is a captain. He's amazing. But because we have so many players, because we run 3 teams, like this week, I think they have over 100 out for practice, which is a lot of people. But I found that over the years, and as a comment was when I was reading through your questions, Jennifer, was like, I don't cut players, I never have, because even if they don't make the varsity team, sometimes they play on the 3rd team or the 2nd team for 4 years at UVic, but they end up being I hate to say it, they're probably the best alumni. They go back to wherever they're from, clubs, or they coach their kids, they coach the club, they sometimes become presidents of clubs, they do. Their involvement is more important to me to give back to the sport. So I just found that over the years, the elite ones that I coached at the national team level, probably some of them have got involved in sport quite a bit. A lot of them, once they're finished, they don't get involved so much. So I've always found that it's a tough balance, but they really are quite amazing of getting involved in all very types of activities, and maybe it doesn't even matter if it's that sport, maybe whatever their kids do, but they try to learn a lot. I think they learn a lot along the way, and a lot of the guys that they play with become their best friends forever.
I can relocate.
It's always interesting to see, a kid from Alberta, one from Saskatchewan, and one from Vancouver, and another one from Quebec, all living together after the first year, right? And they just, I think it's part of the sport, but it's part of a lot of sports like that.
I think if I can jump in, even in answer to Peter's question, I think it was a perfect example with Simone Biles showing the world that it's okay not to be okay. And I think we've been trying to do that a bit with sports, Bell Let's Talk Day and Clara Hughes stepping up and different athletes stepping up. I think there is some good messages that can come from sport because they have a podium and they can show that, the pressures and the expectation, maybe it's the dark side of sports sometimes, but the pressure and the expectation that's put on a lot of these athletes when they get to an elite level is maybe not okay. How do you avoid it? I don't know. That's probably not for me. There's smarter people in the world that could ever figure that out. I think social media is I have a love-hate with it. If I could be off it, I would, but there's value in it. Yet you've got individuals sitting in their basement making comments about athletes who are still human beings with parents and brothers and family and friends. And, to Doug's point, I think there needs to be more appreciation of athletes as a whole. They're not a product that goes out and wins you a medal. They are talk about their whole journey. And I go back to what we're now trying to promote at the Hall of Fame. And it's not just the Hall of Famers' accomplishments in sport, but really what we're telling their whole journey, what they've done to give back to community in Canada after sport and what the value is beyond sport. And I think that sometimes gets really lost in the pursuit of medals and world championships.
Yeah, and I think exactly, and from a practical perspective, what they've done at UVic over the last 3 years to help these athletes that are struggling is unbelievable. Like with people that are dedicated for the department they've got a whole new mental health wing across the street from that's part of the hospital now. And none of that stuff existed before. And the demand is big. And I know at some of the schools, it's big, some friends that teach there. So I think that everybody's woken up and now, and I've had a few, I've dropped out of school, and they're not the best at coming talking to you about it, the rugby players. So it was a real fast learning curve for me because it was something that we weren't really dealing with very well. So I totally I get the resources that need to go behind it, and I like the point about they are attacking athletes who are like, I can't believe it would be attacking athletes like that, but it's just the world we're in right now. We have to filter some of that out, I guess. It's hard.
Doug, you mentioned.
Sorry, Jennifer.
No, you go ahead, Gary.
No, I find it's a curious paradox that sport is not only the thing that helps to relieve anxiety and depression, but it's also a cause of it as well for some athletes.
Yeah.
Tremendous source of anxiety, and that duality. And I coach outside of school 30 or 40 young athletes in distance running, and I would say the easy part of the task is actually designing the workouts and helping them. The sort of the tougher work is actually supporting the teenage angst, the mental health, the insecurities, uncertainties that they face. So I did a little bit of research in preparation for this webinar, and I was looking at this model by a man called Benson. It's Benson's developmental assets, it was called. And he said there was essentially two areas, internal assets, which were values, beliefs, and the commitments that we have. And then the external assets, which were the boundaries that coaches put in place, the connections, the social connections that sport can offer, the empowerment that the athlete has, the positive sense of well-being that the coach helps to generate. And that the greater the amount of assets that we have, the more insulation that the person has against the pressures that they are feeling, whether it's from within, from external sources, whether it's from social media, or whether it's from teams, or whether it's from success that they experience or lack of success. So the greater the resources that the athlete can develop, and of course the coach and the family, the overall environment, the sports environment help to provide the athlete, the more resistant they are to not only just sports pressures, but social pressures. We know that athletes that are very involved in sport are less likely to be involved in alcohol abuse, in drug abuse, in undertaking risky but harmful behaviors. So it's a great insulator, and is one of the reasons why I'm still very involved in sport, because I know what it can mean to young people, not just it's great if you win a race, but if you're giving them some tools that help them to navigate the challenges of life, then that sort of speaks to the mental health piece, and I think it's a noble purpose it serves.
Wonderful. So investing in sport, because it does offer these opportunities to learn so many great things, but also investing in very specifically in developing these assets for athletes. And I hear from Doug too, especially in a way, I don't think we think of this as much, the elites, because they are putting themselves often under more pressure and therefore more susceptible. And then if they do get broken, which is what we see a lot of, you end up catching someone at the end of their career and helping them try to survive into their future, instead of launching them into a wonderful new future in society. And I think, how do we avoid that breakage or their departure? As Doug mentioned, some of his elite athletes end up just kind of, okay, that's enough, I got to go. And wouldn't it be great if they would be those great alumni that came back or gave to their communities or kept involved? But what would that take? And maybe we're not as conscious as we could be of investing in that aspect.
Yeah, I would think that in a lot of sports, like I guess the NHL, or like in professional sports, ones that were, a lot of those athletes that come to a certain age now, they might get bumped around different teams, and then how well do they get transitioned out of the sport? Like same with us with amateur athletes, like how I don't think in general, a lot of times they transition the national team players sometimes out very well. Like they get cut from a team because they're not performing maybe at a certain level, or somebody new's coming in, or new coach comes in and they get cut. And sometimes we don't do a great job of transitioning out. Now they might not want to hear it, but I know that I had to do it a number of times, and it was difficult. But but you say at some point, some people need to move on. And in some cases, in our world, and maybe in running, and maybe it's even curling. But curling, there's maybe some prize money, but if there's not a lot of money involved, that transitioning, just helping them move on, and so they're comfortable with the next stage was for them. They need to get a job. They need a career, like because nowadays they're asking so much of these athletes to give up. The national team level athletes, it's hard to have a job in some of the way that they've got these teams set up in training centers.
So centralized, right? Yeah. So that's another great piece, a big recommendation coming out of this webinar, right? Is that idea of transitioning, and that is at every level of sport. Whether it's a kid who is developing and maybe won't make the A team, but can be on the B team, and there's a clear path for them to develop and maybe aspire to the A, or maybe just stay with the B and have a wonderful time there with some friends and leverage all the value of participating that sport offers. But I'm not sure we have game plan, but not much beyond that, I don't think.
You give me 1 minute to sign off here. Thank you.
I just love watching Gary in action here. Classic middle school teacher. I remember it well. Good thing you like to move, Gary.
It is time for me to go. I'm afraid I'm
Oh.
having to relocate, and I've got about 22 little grade twos just chomping at the bit. Waiting. I
22.
apologize for the early departure, but I really like to thank everyone for the opportunity to chat with you, and it's great getting to know you. And if anyone had any questions on anything that I've said, I'd be more than thrilled to get back to you and have a conversation. So thank you. And I'm sorry I have to go.
No, and thank you so much for your contribution.
You're very welcome.
And I'll
Thank you.
take care.
We'll be in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you soon. And I was mentioning that, you know, Gary and I live down the street from each other, so I see him all the time and his young son flying by. But also that we will link to, you know, the books that people have written and the resources and different things that you mentioned, like NCCP, you know, these kind of acronyms and bodies that we've mentioned throughout the webinar, so that people can explore a little more deeply, because the whole point is learning and sharing other pieces of information. And you've mentioned, you know, other programs happening across the world. We want to link to all those things too. And we will send those out with our recording. All right, so where do we want to go next? I've got media in there, and what is the role of coaches? You know, we've talked a bit about funding organizations, transitioning organizations, national sport orgs. What are the roles of the media? You mentioned a little bit, Cheryl, but what else can we say about, you know, the role of media in sport? It can be, we need to prepare our athletes for interacting, but I often feel that it's a bit of a free-for-all out there, media.
Yeah, no, media is, you know, I can relate a little bit from the 2010 Olympics that, you know, I had to have a significant amount of media training to navigate those waters, and that you didn't have to actually answer the questions that were asked. But there was a lot of strategy from media from different countries through the Olympics, asking questions, you know, why is your one player struggling this week? And, you know, and so there's tactics behind it. You know, the media, they report sport in a wonderful way and the accomplishments. Sometimes I think we need to report accomplishments beyond just the sporting, you know, successes. I think we need to look at, like, the Olympics, where you're starting to look at those, you know, what are the really cool stories that really bring us together and stronger together. We talked about that in the Olympics. Report some of those stories, feature some of the individuals that may not have stood on a podium, but what they've done to build communities and bring us together as a society. I just wish there was more of those stories reported. You know, I think there's an effort around it to do it, but it seems like the negative part of sport can be reported far quicker. And then that just feeds into social media, and it becomes just a nightmare that way. As you can tell, I have an issue with social media.
Well, one thing I noticed is I really heard the athlete voices at this Olympics so strongly. I felt, compared to 2016 Summer Olympics, the difference was quite stark in that they'd really picked up those tools and were using them. And I felt that then the mainstream media was catching a bit of that vibe and starting to promote PBs instead of just the medals, you know, and
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, I thought CBC did a great job, because I think that they really looked for both sides of different stories and not just the sports success. I agree. That was something that I was so impressed with, and I hope there's more of it.
So too, crucial. Yeah. What do you think, Doug?
Yeah, I agree. I think that I like the interest stories that they did during the Olympics. I thought they were really good. Like, it's sometimes the only time we get that, you know, then through the professional sports stuff, like weekly, or it's over the top, like, you know, that just keeps going around and around. And then they, you know, they focus a little bit too much on the controversies, and this person's done this and this person's done that. So it kind of, you know, you become desensitized to it. You kind of just, well, whatever, you know, and then sometimes it's not handled very well by organizations. So now it gives the media another 2 weeks of grinding it out to try to get the whole story. So I find it kind of, yeah, it's irritating. It's really bad when you're involved in a team. I think the first time that there was any training for our national team athletes was the 2002 Commonwealth Games in Manchester, where they put us, all the athletes in a lecture hall, the whole team, and talked to them about the media and how to present the media, because there'd been a positive test. So it was more about the positive test and damage control of that for an athlete who hadn't even arrived yet. So, and it was the first time they'd done any kind of media training, but it was like, now it's, man, it's so much. Like it's so hard to control as a administrator or as a coach. It's really, things just happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, once you get thrown under the bus once by media that you said something. I mean, the thing that bothers me a bit with the media and how it's handled is that, the Olympics are amateur. I mean, maybe golf isn't, maybe there's some sports in there that aren't, but for the most part, there hasn't been a ton of media training.
Yeah.
So I think there's a responsibility from the media to not to try and tell the story well. I mean, you can only report the facts. That is the role of media, but there's some things that untrained athletes will say. They are amateurs, and to be a little bit gentler in that world, I would definitely say. I mean, we've got professional athletes and they know exactly what to say, and their responses are canned typically. And that, I think, is a frustration for media, but there is some responsibility there to respect the amateur athletes and the minor amount of media training they probably have.
Well, it would be a win-win, wouldn't it? Because the stories would be more fulsome and wonderful and would sell more papers if
Yes.
they didn't push the athletes to the point where they were producing canned responses to protect themselves. And isn't this just what Naomi was asking for, right? That, hey, can we have a press conference that isn't quite as attacking, and one that is really actually asking me about what went down during the match, because that's what's actually interesting, and that's where the little stories exist, right? They're in all the moments throughout the actual endeavor. Cool. Media training, and to the point around transitioning or supporting athletes as they move between either levels of sport or out of sport, and Peter was highlighting directly to me here in a DM that UBC is doing a good job on that. They've developed something called Blueprint, and I think there's also another organization trying to partner with universities across Canada to work with athletes to move beyond their varsity experience and into beyond, and you can leverage your sport. I know Andrea's doing some, Andrea Burke, the rugby player that I mentioned earlier, is working with media, and there are lots of avenues where you can continue in the sport realm, but even that needs some support and guidance. Your point about cutting athletes, Doug, earlier, it's interesting how you don't cut. And I love that in an educational setting. Really, why would we cut people? But for a national team athlete, they end up, you make the team or you don't. But I do find we tend to kind of just cut and literally just they're gone. And I think, oh my God, what's the plan for that person? Do they just have to figure it all out on their own? What do you think the role of coaches is in this grand scheme of sport as education?
Boy, well, I think that's one of the first questions, really, wasn't it? I think that it sort of just happens. A lot of it. I mean, depending on how you set up your team and the practical parts of it, I think that helps. I think that there's lots of things you can do with your team, anything from team building to in rugby law, we give a lot of tests, or we work them in groups, and it's as educational as we can. They have to be respectful of the fact that some of them, I had like 12 guys last year who were in engineering, so they're busy, right? But they're probably the guys that miss the least practices. They're organized and they're working hard. So, I think that a lot of it is being good teammates, and been some really good stuff that came out culturally from the New Zealand All Blacks, who were having troubles with their team, and they did some changes. And it's everything from, I've seen it at the national team level where having what we call duty dogs, people are doing stuff every day or sweeping out the change rooms or whatever it is to try to get the team to buy into everything. Where I've also seen teams, I won't name the countries, but they just take their jerseys off and step over them and walk out. And, talking to their management team, physiotherapist said, I'm out. I can't work with these people. They're just too entitled, and it was a real problem. So I think that sort of stuff you're educating them to be better people, I think, down the road. And they ultimately, some of them only have 5-6 years, and then they get a job that's so busy, they play varsity rugby, but they're not interested in going to the next level. And maybe, regardless of what sport it is, maybe they don't want to play until they're 35 years old. So, in a sport like curling, you might get better as you get more experience and get older. But in rugby, there's going to be a point where your body's not going to take it. So you get involved in coaching, and hopefully, I think probably one of the biggest things for me is a lot of the players at UVic have gone on to, there's about 13 to 15 real good high school coaches around BC that are coaching at some of the better rugby schools, and they all played at UVic, and they're awesome. I mean, those guys have given back a lot to the game, and they only played for maybe a few years after they left. So I think that's part of the maybe as a sport for an educator, you give them the information, and some of them are really good, and others, they take what they want. I guess you can't. It's tough when you have big numbers. Like I look at like basketball, like they don't have junior varsity teams anymore at universities. There's usually not. There's not. The resources are tight, so they maybe keep 16 players or 14 players, and maybe only so many can travel. It's a total different setup, right? So, yeah. So to me, I think it happens. A lot of it happens naturally, but I think you have to have the leadership to drive them in that direction. I think that helps.
Yes, clear leadership. And so, connecting up these concepts that, hey, it's an educational institution, a university or a college, high school, we're supposed to be learning. So therefore, what can we do to promote the learning and broaden the learning? JV program is really important. How do we do that? Maybe we can do it in a way that doesn't demand as much resource as we think it does, when we prioritize performance and winning over development, that can cause us to cut things that maybe are really crucial in that environment. And Peter Webster is our main commenter today, but he's out of UBC, and I know Peter, great to see you here. And I think, he's commenting on this connection between what are the roles these different sport bodies play, right? And at a university, it probably is important to keep a bigger team because it is an educational institution. We're trying to develop people. Yeah. And develop them as people. Yeah.
And this has happened at high schools too. When I was teaching high school, all of a sudden we used to have they'd be a grade 8 basketball team, a grade 9 basketball team, grade 10 basketball team. Then they put the 9s and the 10s. So that eliminates half the players. And then, it's happened at universities too, where they used to all have junior varsity teams, and they would play against each other, and they play a prelim game or whatever. It wasn't really super expensive. Sometimes they didn't travel as much, but it's you see it, and everybody's reduced to little things. And there's, because travel's killer in Canada West, and Peter would know that from UBC, like going over the mountains. Every time you go over the mountains, right? It's expensive.
Big country.
Yeah.
And Cheryl, your perspective on this, the role of the coach in developing that culture, making sure, because some people think, coach, technical, someone else needs to take care of all that value stuff or make sure that these people behave and are respectful of one another. What do you think?
I mean, I do think most certainly in youth, and I learned so much from the coaches I had growing up in sport. And I think coaches are educators, and they can teach you how to learn through sport. I mean, my first coach taught me that attitude was everything, and I've carried that with me. Boy, that was when I was probably 12. And I think that's been a big message and lesson for me. And the other one, and I had this up in my mirror the entire time I competed leading up to the Olympics, is that you never lose. You either win or you learn something from it. And that was huge to me because I always looked at losses as a failure. And and that I was, sometimes an athlete you can feel like you're not a good person when you lose and you're a great person when you win. And what a way to go through life, to identify with the wins and the losses. And I've had some great coaches. I've been so fortunate that went beyond just technical, and they pulled out the lessons in life. And boy, I've transferred all those into my personal life and my business life. Again, back to what you said, Jennifer, it's a microcosm, and it's just so valuable. So I do think that is the role of coaches. Now, I respectfully say I have not coached very much at all, so I know it's a tough job. But at the youth, when you get to that, those young people that you're trying to teach lessons to, it's not all about the skills and the technical, and you have such an opportunity to teach some incredible, principles that we can all learn from sport.
I read a little story about Gary when in my research. It's hard to find stuff, as I mentioned, but he did this thing that I wanted to share. He ran a 3:41 for his 1500 meter. This was probably back in 1990s, before the International Track Classic. And so he's geared up. He wants to beat this time. Then he gets a cold. So he gets to the race. He knows he's not going to be top form, but he had set out to compete with his prime rival, Dave Campbell. So instead, they start the race, it's slow, how sometimes they are, that no one's ready to set the pace. So he decided he would help Dave out. So he picked up the pace. Campbell tucks in behind Gary, and Gary sets that pace. And with 300 meters left, Campbell now feels he could kick. He makes a swift move to the front, and Gary said, and I made a swift move to the back. But I thought, wow, there's an example, right, of a beautiful principle that if you aren't quite up to it, you can still play a role and support someone's performance, eh? Gorgeous.
Love it. Love that.
What are some other things that you try to teach, or that you've been taught, or that you've watched and learned from watching others? What are some other key concepts you think?
I mean, I think as an athlete, you have to be really good at making peace with the past, because you lose more than you're ever going to win. So I think that's a really good, I've been able to apply that in my personal life too. I think probably the biggest thing that I've applied in my personal life and in my corporate life is surround yourself with good people. I come from a team. It wasn't always the teams that we recruited weren't always about talent. Talent can be taught. But, ethics and principles and values, I wanted to be with those kind of people on a team. And I honestly believe that was why, we stood on a podium in 2010, was because of the people on that team and the heart and the values and the support and the belief. And I apply that at the Hall of Fame. I've applied that in all of my businesses and boards that I'm involved in, because I think it's so important.
Love it. Beautiful. And Doug, I can see you smiling. Some things are occurring to you.
I like that. I couldn't imagine being on a curling team if you weren't getting along.
Oh, there's nowhere to hide, Doug.
You can see it when you watch it on TV. You can see, if they don't like the skip's decision, or, you got to fall in line, or you can't go off and do your own thing.
No.
Curling, you would be it would probably be your last tournament.
Sweeping all lackadaisically.
Vote. I guess the skip's got the trump on the vote, right?
Almost.
Yeah.
So I always tell my classes that, I honestly believe that coaches are spectators in athlete sport, right? So, and especially in a sport like rugby, you have to develop leaders, because you can't talk to them when the game's on.
Right.
Like you can't at halftime, right? So you don't have much time at halftime. So it's different. Whereas I used to coach a lot of volleyball. And so volleyball, when I was coaching, you weren't allowed to talk. You weren't allowed to stand up. Now they changed all that. Now it's totally different. So what I do like to observe is when coaches start losing, like how does their behavior change? So especially if it's pro coaches or NCAA coaches, or ones that there's a lot on the line, their job, and their job's on the line, do they change the way they coach? Does it affect their players? Or because they're under such pressure, they sort of bring it all home a little bit more. where they'll maybe change up the way they play. So it's always interesting to see the different, how they behave, and do the players act differently because the coach is uptight. Like that football game last night with Cruden. Cruden is the coach of Las Vegas Raiders, and he's got probably some of the best facial expressions of anybody I've ever seen coaching. But he's wound very tight, that guy. So, you know, and does it affect the player? So I'm always interested in that kind of stuff, and I think that, you know, like you try to get I always try to get the players to, what's the motivation, right? Basically, the sport itself is the motivation. Like, if you know, you can't, because in rugby, if you're not motivated, you're going to get hurt. If you're not out there, you know, like you just have to watch watch a few games of All Blacks, New Zealand All Blacks, or South Africa or whatever, the top teams, top 10 teams. Those guys are motivated. Like they're really motivated to win, but they're not making crazy money like in some of the sports. So it's I think sports changed a lot over the years with the number of games they play and all that. It's hard. I can't imagine what it'd be like in that NBA, going from one plane ride to the next. NHL, the number of games they play. And so for me, it's I do believe coaches do the best you can, but from the sidelines, right? And hopefully they're motivated, and you pick good leaders. But it's like it's never easy, because it's, you know, when things do sometimes go off the rails, and you have to deal with it.
Love that. And it, you know, you've mentioned before that sport embodies some of these, it kind of forces us to learn how to work together, be respectful, and coaching forces us to prepare athletes, because you're like, rowing's like that too. You launch them and then you just hope everything works out. You have no
Ride a bike. Don't you ride a bike along the path there and yell at it? But yeah, which I think is great. So, you know, at least you get some fitness when you lose. Right?
Exactly.
Everybody else is stressing out on the sidelines. Like, it would be very hard being a curling coach in the stands watching and miss by millimeters or whatever. Like, you don't know, right? It's a lot of factors. And there's more teams that are better now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the gaps on a lot of sports are closing, right? Like before, there'd be 5 or 6 really good teams, and now there's 10. Or that makes a big difference.
Well, and they come out of juniors and they're ready too now. Whereas before it seemed like you come out of juniors and you had to have a few years to catch up to that next level, and not now. They are so well refined by the time they get there. They just step into men's or women's play.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I find all that stuff, and then how it draws it all into that, you know, goes back to that whole question about what are we trying to do as educators.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you both. I think we have to wrap up. It's 1:30.
Oh, yeah, I gotta go.
You gotta go.
I gotta drive across town.
So we will have this recording out to everybody, and you can send it out across your networks and channels. Appreciate everybody for showing up and participating. Thank you again to my guests, Cheryl Bernard, Doug Tate, and Gary Barber. Fantastic discussion. You've got my head buzzing, and I will take some of these nuggets. I know I'm stealing lots of things, but I'll promote some of those nuggets as we share out the recording as well.
And Peter.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks for your questions. And feel free, anybody who's participating, to share with, follow up with questions directly to me too, and I can get those out to the panelists. Thank you.